Shortly. Good to see so many of you. My only role today is to say hello. I'm going to sit in the back benches, as has already been pointed out to me in a moment when I found my phone. I just wanted to mention two things. Has anyone bought Christmas cards from our website? Yeah, I bought hundreds today. It's a really easy process to get them. There's some fabulous cards there. 20% of the proceeds go back to the Cricket Society Trust, and about half of that actually comes back to us, so we can decide what to do with it. But apart from anything else, they're great value cards. I think at about 60 pence.
Can you buy less than 100? I haven't got 100 friends.
They're in tens. They're in packs.
You've got 10. There are 10 friends, Derek.
There are different sorts of cards, but they're all good, and I think they're a step up for us. So please support it. And if you don't want to pay online, there's a phone number and an address, so you can give them a ring and discuss other ways of payment. It's outsourced to a company called 4C. What else did you want me to say? Paul Farbrace has been called off to be a manager of a T10 side somewhere. So for some reason he prefers that to talking to us in December at the Union. November. Or was it November? November. We're still looking for a replacement. Depending on who we get, we might switch it here. Save a bit of money there. The other thing I wanted to mention was we've had days at the cricket, which I hope are enjoyable for people. Some of us were at the Cricket Writers Club last week, and after you've had a half shandy or two, ideas get thrown around. We thought, what about a day at the races? That's the horse races. It's something I've done from the Civil Service Club, actually. Very, very, very social. We're researching it, but just a show of hands, would anyone in principle be interested in that sort of social outing? Few of you. Yeah, lots of you. Okay, that's useful to know. Thank you. Phil.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening, Charlie Sale. Charlie has written a fascinating book about MCC and the shenanigans that have gone in the last 20 years, entitled The Covers Are Off. Copies will be available to purchase at the interval. We hope to do about 45 minutes of conversation with Charlie, and then we'll open up for questions after a short break. Now, Charlie, I think most of you probably know, is distinguished journalist, 30 years at the Daily Mail, retired now. It's his second book, actually. He might tell you about his first book after halfway, because it's a slightly niche topic, I think, Charlie, I think to say. But the second book is really about MCC and Lords and the development thereof. Now, I'll declare a sort of an interest here. I'm not an MCC member, I'm a Middlesex member. I've been going to Lords for many, many years, probably about 40 years. I'm old enough, and you'll struggle to believe this, to actually see the first Compton Edridge stands when they went up all those years ago. And I remember they went up during the cricket season, and they had art welding behind the bowler's arm. It was different times then, but that was how it was. But Lords has always been a very special place for me, and it is to mention. Nigel found his mobile. Lords has always been a very special place. I always remember John Arler always saying, he said, there's an inherent rightness about the place, and I think that's probably true. But there's been a rather interesting story about it in its history, and this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. So, Charlie, I wonder if you could just say a few words about the history of Lord's Ground, how it came to be at the ground it is, and how MCC didn't own all of it.
Well, I'm preaching to a lot of the converted here, looking around this audience, especially the front row. The people who know a lot more about MCC and Lords than me, but have a go. I don't want to get too bogged down in the history, but as you probably know, most of you know, the current ground was the third ground. They started in Dorset Square, and the Heir Estates put the rent up, so they moved to another ground, and the Regent's Canal went through that. So Lords was the third ground, which they took the turf from the previous one. I think it was 1812, and they've been there ever since. They didn't, when it said that they used to earn a load more than they do now. In 1929, they owned every single house around the perimeter. There were 14 houses. Because Gubby Allen, who I think worked with somebody who's here in the audience tonight, rather than put the subscriptions up, which were £20 a year at the time, he sold another house, which is a bit ridiculous considering they bought six Grove End Road for 8.5 million in 2014. So, I mean, history has tended to repeat itself over the history of Lords. Things that happened just recently also happened in the 1800s. For instance, obviously there's the auction when they lost we'll come to that in 1999, but 100 odd years before that, there was an auction and they didn't even bother turning up. So the ground then fell into the hands of a guy called Isaac Moses, who then sold it back 8 or 9 years later for 3 times the cost. And again, then history repeats itself. When they were, before the auction, Railtrack were going to were disposing of their 2 tunnels under the nursery ground. People have been down there. They're fantastic Victorian tunnels. And it's a massive space. And after the beaching cuts, because going ahead in 1891, when there was a compulsory purchase order for commuter trains going into Marylebone. So they did a deal with Great Central Railway, as it called at the time, whereby they had that strip of land, 200 meters by 38 meters, and in return, they then got where all the indoor school is now, which there was an orphan school there, and so they had sort of really increased the nursery end, but obviously they lost the ground under the tunnels because British Great Central Railway leased it back to Lords on a long lease and the 18 inches above. So that's why they don't own the full area around Lords. Although most people, I mean, this whole story is basically a secret from the 18 because the way MCC, be careful with people, some of the people in the audience, the way MCC have conducted themselves is they don't communicate with the membership. Simple as that. It's very much on their terms. So this story is basically sort of a secret to, I would say, the vast majority of the 18,000 members. So when I don't know how much history you want to get into. Carry on. Or
No, it's very good so far. But I mean, obviously.
So true.
We've got a bit further to go yet, but we'll work on that. But if people know the ground, the strip of ground we're talking about here is the strip at the nursery end, right by the exit wall there. And I think most people have walked along the Wellington Road there. There's that horrible prison wall, they call it there. You can't see anything there. And it's the strip just inside that we're talking about that MCC had a long lease on, but they didn't own. And in the book, Charlie, there's a lovely line. It said, the author's view is that everything goes back to the 11th of December, 1999. And this was the period when Railtrack, being the British Rail successor, were trying to get a bit of money in. So they thought, oh, we own that strip of land there. Let's see if we can flog it. And that's really the nub of the story, Charlie. So take us through that process.
Well, as you say, 1891, so eventually they built these tunnels, and it roughly remained the same situation for the next century. Eventually they did a long deal. So basically you got a situation when MCC had a nice lease where they had the leasehold on this strip of land, as Phil says, along the Wellington Road. And then they became Railtrack, and after beaching cuts, 2 of these commuter lines were no longer in use. And so they wanted to sell off all their assets. So they approached in the spring of 1999, they approached the MCC, said, well, can you sell, we'll offer you this land. The MCC obviously thought that they were the only bidder, but they should have known, because just before that, a property developer, not the guy who bought it, his cousin called Johnny Sandelson, who's quite a dodgy character. But he approached, but he was also, I mean, it's unbelievable, this pilot really, but he at the time was a son-in-law of Lord Alexander, who was one of the chairman of one of the committees, later become chairman of Barclays Bank. It's a big, high-standing figure. The fact that Johnny Sandelson was his son-in-law was quite strange, but I don't think the marriage lasted that long. Anyway, so Johnny Sanderson approached Lord Alexander, who got him a sort of in to see Roger Knight, the secretary. But MCC at that time, was a sort of run sort of feudal situation, which, I mean, the chief executive is the secretary, is run by the chairman and the treasurer. And as far as the estates were concerned, that was run by the chairman of the estates, a guy called Maurice Theron. So basically, Johnny Sanderson he was a developer. And if you look down that Wellington Road, every area apart from that brick wall, the prison wall, is developed. The hospitals down to the Danubius Hotel. So Johnny Sanderson was perfect residential. It's quite extraordinary, because if you actually look down that strip of land now, it's a tip. It's a load of rubbish bins in a car park. It looks an absolute mess even now, even after all this fuss. Anyway, so Johnny Sanderson saw the potential of this and came in to see Roger Knight and Maurice Theron. Maurice Theron just walked out. So that was that. And until just before the auction, because the MCC had 6-7 months negotiating the rail track, and the most they offered in that, well, for their first offer was £900,000, because they saw it purely as the lease. They at the time they were paying £37,000 a year, so they just saw it, is it worth it? If we don't have to pay that in return for the lease. So they thought that originally £900,000 would be actually, that land is now land values worth over 300 million. So that's like, but at the time, they just purely saw it as a rental. But they shouldn't, because Johnny Sanderson had pointed out that, and Colin would tell you at the time, but the way MCC ran in those days was, Chairman of States Maurice Theron, so Roger Knight deflected everything to Maurice Theron. So we get to the auction, and because MCC played hardball with Railtrack were looking for 1.75, rather, because they had to justify, they had shareholders, they had to justify the sale. MCC first offered 900,000, and eventually go up to 1.25. So the Railtrack guy said, well, we'll take it to auction. They did it to try and up the price. They thought, we'll get a bit more on that. But MCC, then the auction takes place. The night before, Charles Rifkin who had been alerted, because he was doing property deals with his cousin at the time, was alerted to the auction. He also saw the absolute potential of this site. And we get to the auction at the Four Seasons Hotel, and basically only two players. And MCC had the mandate from the committee to go up to 2.3 million. That was their top whack. So it goes up, there are only two bidders. So it gets to 2.3 million, and Charles Rifkin comes in about 1.5. Eventually, Knight Frank, the agents, bung in their 25,000 fee. So their last bid was 2.325. And Charles Rifkin wins their biggest mistake in the history of the MCC by a distance. But I mean, the background is that that's why then, so the next, okay, so they've lost it. And obviously, there's a lot of upsetters or humiliation within the MCC. Maurice Theron is convinced that that Johnny Sanderson was tipped off by his father-in-law, who sat in on the committee that made the decision, that 2.3 would be the top thing. Now, this is denied, and Lord Alexander, sort of, absolute sort of captain of industry, very massive reputation, but who knows about families. But Maurice Theron, who died in 2006, went to his deathbed convinced that that's right. So Rifkin, he wasn't interested. Rifkin at the same time had had got the head lease. He then went to Railtrack for the development rights as well, because he saw the potential, not just as a lease, but obviously the money is in if you get planning permission. That's when the 300 million comes in. Eventually, he thought he'd get it for a snip, but Railtrack found out it was him. He was a guy, very successful property developer within that area. And their advisors, when they found out he was involved, tipped off Railtrack, look, if he's involved, up the price. So now they've got a deal with him that when it's developed, index linked, they get sort of 6-7 million. I think it's up to 10 million now. So there we go. And then up to then, that was the situation 2001. But this is unknown at the time. So the rank, I'm sure some of you are MCC members, certainly one was working with the MCC at the time, it's 1975. 2006, two things happened. One, Maurice de Rohan died, and Keith Bradshaw became the new chief executive, still secretary, might be called chief executive eventually, of the MCC. So eventually Charles, who in those previous 5 years had come up with various schemes, actually got through the great gates for the first time. And we get to the sort of vision for Lords, which was
which was the sort of first real sort of go at this development. But just going back briefly, Charlie, to the underbidding, there was a reason why they did underbid, wasn't there? And that goes back to
So there is because they just built the awful looking media centre, which anyway is a terrible building, I personally think. But it's supposed to cost budget 1.5, eventually cost 5.3 million, and they just built the grandstand as well. They had a bank loans at the time at 15 million. So there's no way, they could. They said, if you speak to the people who were involved in the finance committee at the time, they said, well, we couldn't go any higher, we just didn't have the money. And we didn't see in Charles Park, we just didn't. He said that Rifkin was a clever guy. We didn't see the development potential. So, and also if you see that media centre now, it's an awful place to work. And they I don't think it's personally, I don't think it fits in with the Compton Hedge stands at all. I think it's a mess now, but it's my personal opinion. It was a monochrome, I think that's the right word. So it's a whole boat, like a boat. So the cost of getting it up from Portsmouth, wherever they built it, was astronomical. So there we are. We got to 2001. We've got 20 years to go.
As you say in the book, that's really the crucial moment, because they underbid and they suddenly let this character called Charles Rifkin in.
Yeah,
and they probably felt at that time reasonably secure because they had 120 years lease on it. They felt fine. Yeah. But clearly it hurt that they didn't get it. Maurice de Rohan, who you talked about, was clearly very annoyed about it. And they weren't really sure who this character Rifkin was. No. And what his intentions were, and certainly a lot of he has been portrayed in the press as a ruthless property developer and various other things. So I think you think he's somewhat nuanced. Do you think that's a bit
no? He's very successful. Still is a very successful guy, but other people might think differently. But obviously, inside MCC, their view is forget him. So it's very difficult to break it when MCC they dictate all the sort of communications and whatever. It's a sort of secret society with 18,000 members, so who only find out what they want to tell you. To a certain extent, it's still the case. So I mean, Rifkin couldn't get in the door, and at the end, and even now, the vast majority of MCC men probably don't want residential at the nursery end, but we'll come to that. Eventually, though, he gets in with Keith Bradshaw, who was a sort of complete different from previous chief executives, sort of Australian guy, who got on really well with Charles, and they sort of started building up plans for. Because Charles also bought the Grove End Road, because we obviously had the event previously in 1920 on before Gubby Allen started selling. They owned every single house around the perimeter, which is a great situation to be in. But now they own 3 on Grove End Road, and Charles Rifkin bought 3 in about a couple of weeks without the MCC realising. So he had parity at the Grove End Road, and he was the landlord at the nursery end. So he was in a difficult position. But again, you should think about the situation. And another fact that came in, he was Jewish, which anti-Semitism is one of those sort of areas, perhaps in any Anglo-Saxon organisation, there's a sense of that. But I think, speak to some people who thought that played a part, another reason why they didn't want to deal with him. But that's a sort of, obviously it's a grey area. It's neither, it's a personal opinion on that respect. But eventually they built up this vision for Lords, which is a sort of a fantastic scheme. Sort of 4 residential towers at one, or a massive tower, or absolute, huge tower where that car park is now with the plans. And because I mean, the Grace Gates isn't a great entrance to Lords. You come in Lords, the awful banqueting suite on the left, so back of it's not a grand entrance for a grand ground. So the plans on the Grove End Road were pretty exciting. So new entrance, and they've opened it up. Of course, it also opened up the Wellington Road, which still remains a prison wharf. So the vision for Lords gets going, and then you get to this sort of nub of the thing. I mean, Charles Rifkin is a very dynamic guy, and once he gets, I mean, the difference between him and the way MCC operate is completely different. MCC, Charles Rifkin is the sort of guy, if you speak to him, he's on to you the next, well, not the next day, a couple of hours later, how did the meeting go? Where are we going from here? MCC, well, we've got to go through about 5 committees. We'll see you in 3 months' time. And literally, that's the situation. So neither side understood each other. But nevertheless, they still built up this sort of head of steam because Charles got some very influential supporters around, and he plays his team well. He played the press really well as well at that stage, so to the extent that this whole thing, and people get the impression the whole of the MCC membership were in favour of the development, when in fact, was never put to the membership properly. So we get to the vision for Lords, which basically got a bit out of control because there's Undercroft. They're going to build an Undercroft, and they're going to have an indoor school. They've got quite a good indoor, well, very good indoor school at the moment. We're going to have a new indoor school with 16 lanes and a full run up, 6 squash courts. God knows why they wanted that. And they went around every department in the MCC asking, what did you want in this? And they said, oh, I was shocked. So at the time, the 2 most powerful guys in the thing were Oliver Stockton and Justin Dowley, who captains of industry, gave their time for free. They had their views just as much as Charles had his views. And then also the development committee was then formed to try and push the thing through, with John Major on it, Lord Grabiner, lots of captains of industry, Michael Atherton. He's not a captain of industry, he's a captain. But all throughout this time, though it developed, the 2 most powerful guys were never, they were never going to agree to it. I mean, they just didn't. Justin Dowley was even more than Oliver Stockton. I mean, Justin Dowley was the Ascot Authority. Their stand was a disaster, their new grandstand. So he was sort of nervous about that, although he said he wasn't, but it must have had some effect. But together, those 2, they might say one thing. The way the MCC works, this development committee, had Sir John Major and people in it, they thought, what we say decides. But it's not. All they could do is recommend the main committee what they want. This main committee is 22 guys, or 20, manipulated brilliantly by the chairman, who made sure that he got his ducks in a row before the meeting started. By the time he got around to John Major, he was 19th out of 20, so there were 18 people giving their views. So it was a no-go. So the vision built up for a number of years until we get to the sort of 2011, which was the sort of blood on the carpet, as one of the chapters is called, where basically Robert Griffiths, who's the leading the development committee, and sort of very passionate. But Charles plays it well. He took Robert Griffiths to St. Petersburg for his 50th birthday. So Charles knew how to play the game. There's 2 sides. But then Griffiths made the mistake of calling for the head of Stockton Dowley, thinking they were disrupting the process, which they probably were, but you don't say that to the chairman and the treasurer. So they basically disbanded the development committee at this famous meeting, and that was 2011. Then you had Keith Bradshaw, but Alma Cantor were again, but they said, okay, we'll see this thing through with Alma Cantor, who had recently appointed the development plan. But that was shenanigans as well, because there were 3 shortlisted. There's one bit I couldn't put in the book. Actually, it's taped, so I probably won't say.
Well, it's just stopped. That's why I was fiddling around.
Well, I would say if it's stopped, I'd probably. I mean, I'm sure people here know the thing, but I mean, there were 3 bids, shortlisted bids for to be the property developer, property partner for the development partner for the vision, and 2 of them put in non-compliant bids, and people who involved the MCC consultants at the time thought the other 2 had been got at, which is almost illegal. Well, it's criminal if you've done that with the council or whatever. And I know, if I speak to me personally, I'll tell you, the guy who actually went around and saw that, he's a very powerful guy, very rich. So I'm not going to mention him in a public place like this in case he comes after me.
Very wise, Joe. Very wise.
Yeah. So then you get Alma Cantor. So Stockton Dowley basically got rid of the development committee, but they're still at the time pursuing with Alma Cantor, but they're never really not going to do it. At the end of the 2011, they ditch Alma Cantor and instead they go for their own master. Well, Major resigns, causes a lot of fuss. But again with Major, Stockton and Dowley thought he was just, they didn't think just Prime Minister, they weren't impressed with it at all. Bizarrely, for as I say in the book, actually quoted, but as Chancellor Exchequer, they thought he knew nothing about economics or finance. They thought the cricketers on the committee, Mike Gatton, Christ. He knew more about economic finances than John Major. I mean, Dowley says that he didn't understand what net present value is. Not quite like that. But basically, he said that MPs, well, cabinet ministers, work to a budget, an annual budget, rather than having to that year, rather than looking to sort of the cost, the difference of capital expenditure and whatever, as against what you get out of it at the time. So, so Major was binned and made a fuss about it. He said after the meeting that although he disagrees, he'd go quietly, but then he leaked something to the Telegraph. Actually, much to my annoyance about that. Really annoyed about that. Said that he'd been, but again, the MCC said that he left not because they disbanded the vision, but because of the process of disbanding it, which is sort of like, Stockton and Dowley, basically, in the way they pay. But Stockton and Dowley, the other side might see them as the sort of gruesome twosome, as they call them, but they were bright guys. They thought, they weren't being paid. They took their sort of stewardship of Lords seriously, and then Stockton told me that Stuart Lipton, who's another big property guy, told him, you're in charge of one of the iconic sites in London in sport. Make sure you do nothing to change it. So, although if you look at it now, I mean, you walk down that strip now, and it's just rubbish. You could hardly see the even Gubby Allen. They built the Compton Edrich stand very shallow, so Gubby could, or somebody, Colin who's in the audience probably knows better than me about that, but so that Gubby Allen could see the trees in St John's Church Gardens from his room in the committee room. So, and now Compton Edrich is massive, it was a slight view through the trees, but I think the Compton Edrich stand now makes it look far more like a stadium. And it's the sweep is with the media centre to make it look like a sweep from behind, rather than like the Lords being a cricket ground with the stand. The fact that the Morley plan, which is the last plan, we'll come to that, had the single stanchion, I think would be far, sort of lectern style stanchion, I think would be far more in keeping with Lords and look better. But we get to that. So we've got to 20.
Yeah. There's some fascinating
2012
stuff in the book here about the vision for Lords. There's some wonderful architects diagrams. An awful lot of money was spent on the vision for Lords, with architects' fees, and millions of pounds was spent. And like you say, Charlie, I don't think Stockton and Dowley ever had a view that it would ever happen.
No,
Therefore, it's absolutely remarkable that happened in that way. But the blocks of the residential blocks of flats there at the Wellington Road end look really nice. Apparently, Geoffrey Boycott was going to put in an offer for one, so you can imagine Geoffrey would top the penthouse there, did love that sort of thing. But there are also some other really lengthy things. There was the plan to take the Wellington Hospital underneath and the Danubius Hotel. So an enormous amount of work was done on this plan, and it came to committee, and that was that's it. Yes, she's gone.
Well, again, you could have mentioned. I mean, that made sense because the Wellington Hospital, they were on the thick Victorian walls, would be perfect for operating theatres. And they're going to link with the Danubius Hotel, which is, they're going to make that into a private hospital there and sort of link the two together, which is a fantastic plan. In fact, there's a new £1 billion, £2 billion hospital being Cleveland Clinic, which is some of the people who are involved in that were also involved in this. So the idea all came from that, because sort of private hospitals around, big area around that. It would have made sense. And obviously, rather than what horrible sort of prison wall, you open up Lords and hopefully inspire young cricketers. That would have been the idea, looking into this great ground. The fact is, even if Gubby had sat and he's still sitting in his seat overlooking the committee room, he could hardly see this new development. It certainly looked better than a load of cars and dustbins and whatever. That awful nursery pavilion, which I'm sure he sat in at AGMs and stuff, which is also rubbish. No, so the Wellington, I mean, they would have basically paid for the whole thing. So
Yeah, I mean, there was a big argument, wasn't there, Charlie, about how they share the profits. I mean, Rifkin thought it was 50-50, but then MCC kept saying, oh no, it's 75-25.
Well, that's what advisors said. Yeah,
quite a bit of difference between those.
Well, yes,
millions and millions of pounds. So,
well, he was. I mean, Charles's view on that when the lease was done, it was 75. So he only gets 75% of the the rental at the moment, because British Railtrack get 25% because of the deal. So there's no way that he then thought it should be a 50-50. Although MCC's advisors were insistent that MCC who bring more to the party. But then again, that was one of the massive stumbling blocks, and still is if ever a deal is to be done. Now the Wellington Hospital would have. I mean, these tunnels are extraordinary, even for car park. Even the whole thing of throughout all this time, Charles can be irritating, as Matthew Engel says in the. Sorry, if anybody works for Charles is in the audience, will probably agree that he's demanding, but that car park to me makes total sense. Not much car parking around there anyway. You could have used those tunnels for that at least. So then we get basically to so the MCC instead got their master plan, which is also to build stand by stand, as they've done with the Warner stand, and they've just done with the Compton Engine stand, which they pay for via the same old debentures, accelerated membership. I mean, they've gone accelerated membership 6 times now. I mean, how many times can you go to that well? Debentures, I love a debenture as well. So we then get to 2017 when Stocking goes and Corbett comes in. So and also people like, I don't know if Paddy Briggs is in the audience.
Don't think he is.
But Paddy Briggs was one of the ones who, because 2012, one of the things Bradshaw brought in was a forum for MCC members. But that didn't last long because John Fingleton, who's quite a well-known MCC character, described the T20 crowd as the great unwashed. And so they closed that down, but they now have this independent forum, which was not used only used by a fraction of the membership, but is a focal point for all the sort of complaints about this. And this is where they sort of aired opinions, and various people sort of got together and wanted a proper independent investigation into the whole development plan, why a 400 million scheme had been basically sort of binned in the way it was, leading to the resignation of a prime minister. But eventually, so 2013, so the Paddy Briggs led, actually he's not here, it's easier to talk. The 2013 SGM was a sort of disaster for the sort of requisitionists. They also got to realise the MCC got a postal vote. It doesn't really matter what the thing is. They're winning the postal vote anyway. So one of the extraordinary things about this story is that they didn't give Charles Rifkin a level playing field. They could, because when they eventually we build up to 2017 and a binary choice between his vision and their master plan, basically stand by stand. They should have let Charles. They had road shows and stuff, and didn't let him in, or he couldn't give his brochure out and whatever. They're going to win it anyway with the postal vote. They should have given him everything he wanted and more, so at least he couldn't say he hadn't had a fair hearing. Throughout this whole story, the whole thing, my thing on this is why didn't they just, eventually with his last scheme, why didn't they get to a situation whereby they try and work with him and say, look, what do you want? How can we work for both of us? There's also talking about extraordinary sums of money as well. So the 2017 vote is 90% in favour of non-residential. It's complete. So it was never going to. To win, but I don't think Charles Rifkin was even invited to the vote, which was held in. Well, he wasn't. Westminster, he was an MCC member, and then since then they built a Compton Engine stand. And the 2019 was a fantastic year for Lord's MCC with a World Cup win and 50 million in the bank. So they think, everything's great. We can afford the Compton Edridge. Everything's looking rosy. We've got the two test matches a summer, which has also always been a vital part of the whole story. And then we obviously get the pandemic, and they're suddenly strapped for cash. They need 15 million in a hurry. So again, you think this is the guy who's offered them 150 million. They just dismiss his idea in 20 minutes at a committee meeting. But he makes a massive error, is that he introduces, because he's fed up with the way he's been, understandably, fed up with the way he's been treated by MCC over the years. So he gets Baroness Scotland, of all people, who's quite a flawed character herself, to introduce this scheme, which was madness. And then he gets James Mitchell and Guy to put his terms, which are 50-50, and he wants the £1 million plus that he spent building up a joint venture back on the return to by MCC, which they haven't shown anything doing. But they dismiss that, and they go down, of course, the life memberships again, and they raise rather than 15, and they raise 27 million pounds, pretty quick, couple of months. And MCC are brilliant at that, stage managing those type of things. They get some people like Mike Gatting to speak favourably about the current sort of regime and what they do. They do these things well, and so now we are where we are. There's still 115 years to go on the lease, and see what happens.
But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot of people at Lords who just don't want to have residential. I mean, Mike really is a trustee, I think, of MCC, and he's very worried about the effect it will have on the nursery ground, because they still think they can play first-class cricket there. And if you had these apartments very, very close to the nursery ground, it might eat in some of that, and that's a sort of a legitimate cricketing issue. But again, the amount of money that there is there is just stunning, and you get this conflict between the people who want the money and the people who might want Lords to remain as it is.
Well, absolutely, yeah. Mike really, I'm not overly fond of it. People, he was a hero of various people growing up, and now he's taken the Kool-Aid thing, as somebody said. He's just an establishment guy, you know. I think the last person who thinks, once they get a sniff of the committee and the sort of perks, people like him, Angus Fraser, Mike Gatting, you know, they suddenly become massive establishment figures. The thing is, with the Compton Edgerich stand, what they've done, and they admit to doing this, they put the footprint a bit further back, so it already impacts on the nursery ground. If you want to play first-class cricket again on the nursery, which isn't going to happen, but plan is in 6 years when they get rid of the nursery pavilion, they will go back. They won't, because the ground, the road, the boundary road will have to be right against the wall, which obviously stymies any residential. So that was a tactical plan, which they admit to. I mean, yeah, there are all sorts of things. Security they put out, you know, the shadows on the ground, loads of excuses. But you know, okay, fair thing. But each time it was sort of came back. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's a private members club, and if the members didn't want residential, then why should I have it? It's interesting to see what happens in the future. This obviously hasn't played out yet, but obviously, personally, I think it's inevitable. But it'll need a sort of complete change of personality, because the way the personnel running MCC, because the way this works, saying, "Oh, it's a revolving door," as Chris is back at the room likes calling it, and you get the chumocracies, was his words. You get the same old people replacing the same old people with the same old views. I mean, Gerald Corbett's been replaced by the guys also replaced him as chairman of moneysupermarket.com. You know, same old. Robert Lee's been on the MCC committee for 40 odd years and whatever, since he was the friend of the secretary, Mike Griffiths' son at Lancing College or whatever. So once you've got that type of sort of thing, it takes more than a couple of generations to change. And then they say they're reforming, but not really. I think the new sort of non-code nominations committee is still run by the same sort of people, so they'll still appoint the same sort of person.
Yeah. I think the question I sort of put to you when we first met to talk about this was, given that the MCC has a fairly conservative and small C membership, do you think that any residential development at Lords have producing however much money could ever have got through that membership, even if it had massive committee support. Obviously, it never had anywhere near that support. But do you think there was a chance of it going through? I mean,
Well, not the way the MCC ran, but if they'd worked, well, that's the thing, it shouldn't have got to the stage where the MCC had to explain. They should have worked up over the years. They worked up to a scheme, be it a hospital or a sports clinic or been a residential, worked up a scheme that the MCC liked, even if it's just car parking under the tunnels. They never even got to, because of the animosity from the start, they never got to a time when they actually properly engaged with Charles Rifkin. So any scheme that worked wasn't given the chance to develop until you get to this sort of this vote in 2017, which wasn't a level playing field. Sort of brochures weren't out, and Charles's supporters, included Time Paddy Briggs, said because MCC like recommending something before the event takes place. I mean, Oliver Stockton once starred 4 candidates. They have a starring system when they have the people in the election. So, and there's Mark Williams, who was a guy who was quite outspoken and wanted to actually have dialogue with members. Once you're elected, you have to take a year off and try elected again. And Oliver starred 4 guys for 4 places, purely to keep Mark Williams off the thing. And also the MCC, sort of the way they do, they recommend something. So, I mean, most MCC members, they're only interested in cricket. Oh, the MCC recommend, they tick whatever it is. You sort of bring back hanging, they just, well, probably they just tick the relevant box. So no, but I mean, this will only work, and still will only work, when you get an MCC regime prepared to, well, it won't be Guy Lavender certainly won't, because he's been basically briefed, it's too much for somebody.
He's on the committee, huh?
Sorry?
He's on the main committee, huh?
Yeah. But I mean, for him to, it needs people to talk to Charles. But I mean, Charles has got 2 able sons who spent the last 25 years talking about this around the dinner table. So they'll inherit, and then they'll be back. If they have any of Charles's, Charles's sort of way of sort of relentless approach, then this won't go away. And eventually, 116 years time, he gets his family get the thing anyway. Have to obviously come to deal before then, but I suspect that there will be development there of some kind.
but there was at one stage, I can't remember, Charlie, which stage it was, but when I think probably when the Vision for Laws fell apart, there was a plan that maybe MCC would speak to Rifkin and try and buy the freehold off it. But nothing came of that, did it?
Well, no, it was a negotiation tactic. I mean, he wanted too much money. I mean, he still does.
Yeah.
He wanted, because he was fed up with all the dialogue. Said, "Oh, buy me out." But I think they were going to pay. He wanted 75 million, and Justin paid 7.5. So there's a bit of a disparity
The difference,
of the for that to happen. But then you get sort of the people. I mean, throughout this, also the sort of interesting guys who, like John Major, people like sort of David Gower, for instance, who was sort of supportive and non-supportive, and described the MCC as sort of sheep, egg and bacon, blazer wearing sheep who just follow whatever the MCC committee told them. But again, the Lord still looks nice, but I really do feel that Compton Edge's new one is too big. Even the side bit, too. I'm interested in what people's views are. We have a question and answer second. Do you feel that 2 individual stands would have looked better?
Yeah. Right, so we're almost at the break. I'm just going to ask you one thing, Charlie. Look with your crystal ball in the future. How do you think this will end up? Do you think that there will ever be residential at Wellington Road in our lifetimes?
In our lifetime, I don't know. There's nobody under 70 in the room.
You got 2 here.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm not sure about our lifetime, but 30 years, 30 years, you've got to do something. I mean, maybe not sort of 5 levels of residence, 5 blocks and massive tower, but sports clearly the last plan. I mean, the pity is the Morley plan, the last plan, which is sort of relatively street residential, is nice, which would pay for these nice lectern style stands at the Compton Edge and a way through, because what people like Lord Grabner say, you open up the Wellington Road and you see kids, it's just a wall. You want to encourage, cricket is like now competing with other sports for people's interests. You see this great ground or wall there sort of blocks them out. If you have a sort of open and sort of, you can't even see, you won't see a pavilion from there, just see a cricket ground.
Yeah.
Inspire, get people's interest, and that's the way it works, isn't it? Sort of getting kids' interest again. So I would say there is a development. I think that eventually it'll come to a deal, but it won't be with the current regime in place, nor the next one, nor the one after that. It's a 20 years no, 30 years perhaps worth of a punt.
Well, we'll come back. We'll get you to come back and talk about it, Charlie, when it happens.
Nobody else will do it.
Thank you, Charlie, for a very entertaining first half.